G'day everyone. So I got interested in training for stress when I started working for Steve. I should preface this that I'm not going to be talking about training for how to deal with burnout. I don't think that's a thing. What I'm going to be talking about is training for acute stress. And people who've been to my talks before, if you've been on a talk like this before, consider it spaced repetition. But I also like to do a little bit of a survey to start off with. So everyone stand up if you've experienced acute stress before. Okay. So, okay. Now, stay standing if you think that that acute stress may have somehow impaired your performance with whatever you were doing. Okay, so it looks like you're in the right talk, and and so that's why we're here to talk about it, basically. And so the last thing is I want you to sit down if you've never received any formal training on how to deal with that acute stress as part of your professional training. Okay, so most of you. The rest of you can sit down as well now. Just before I go into all this stuff, I want to acknowledge all the people who've influenced me and helped me learn about this stuff, and a lot of it came out of a workshop we used to do at SMAC with the same name as this talk, and there's a web page there, intensiveblog.com, training for stress, that has links to references and slides and everything else that you might need. So these are the main things I want to do. I want to talk about what acute stress is and its effects on performance, and then some strategies and techniques about how we can maintain performance in stressful situations. And there's one slide that you need to remember, if you remember nothing else, and I'll explain why at the end, but it's Mr. T saying, beat the stress full. Okay. So what is stress? Well, it's a bit like pornography, isn't it? Hard to define, but you know it when you see it, and that's why I'm going to show you a video. So when you watch this video, I want you to just think about what's going on here, what's stressful about it. It's not a porno. And what are the manifestations of stress as we go through it. Turn up the volume or make it more stressful.
Burp, please. I lost him again. What you said is 90. There it is. Okay. You do see the cords? Do you see the cords? The button's all the way on the left. I mean, that one there.
So, just keep in your mind what was going on in that situation, what was it about that environment, that situation that was stressful, and how it seemed to be manifesting on that poor chap trying to get the tube in there, because we'll come back to it shortly. But basically, this is what the stress response is when we're talking about acute stress response. It's an evolved stereotypical response with physiological and psychological effects. But it's slightly different for everyone in that we have different things will trigger us off, and how it will manifest, while it's within a spectrum, will manifest slightly different, and those manifestations will affect each of us differently in terms of how it impairs our performance. And it doesn't matter who you are, this will happen to you. We're all human beings. This is part of being human. So no matter how resilient you are, how much resilience training you have, there is a situation that can be created that will make you break. And as Steve has said, we're predisposed to those situations. This, take it with a bit of a grain of salt. It's from Siddle and Grossman. They kind of came up with this thing whereby you can grade different types of manifestations of stress with heart rate, but I don't really believe that when your heart rate hits 175 you automatically shoot yourself. But that is a phenomenon certainly in the military, and it's very, very common if you talk amongst people who go into combat, that's why they have battle craps before they go into battle, because they don't want this to happen to themselves. But the principle is correct. Hopefully that doesn't happen so often in the resus room. But the principle is that the greater the amount of stress that you're under, the more stuff that happens to you that impairs your performance. So first of all, you'll lose fine motor control, then more complex type stuff will happen. Eventually you'll get tunnel vision, you get auditory exclusion as well, so tunnel hearing, and as we'll talk about, you can get this tunnel thinking, whereby our cognitive bandwidth decreases, constricts, and it gets filled up with just a whole lot of stuff that's going on. And ultimately, the worst case scenario is people go silent, their cognitive bandwidth has decreased so much that there is only one slot, and the only thing that's filling that slot is them saying to themselves, I'm screwed, over and over. And I think I've been close to that situation, particularly early on in my training, and I'm pretty sure I've seen it happen in resus rooms. And the real clue to me is when people go silent in say, a resus situation. So how is the stress response triggered? So let's go back to that video. What was going on there? There was the noise, wasn't there? Those alarms beeping, all the talk going on around. You can imagine how many people were in that room watching the person performing the intubation. And socio-evaluative stress is actually one of the most potent forms of stress. We'll probably all agree we'd much rather be dealing with someone dying than having people watching us, say, suture up a minor wound and giving us feedback on it. Plus, that's a time-critical situation and it's high stakes. And, you know, that chap's probably a shift worker and he may not have eaten or slept or been to the bathroom for a long time. So all these factors come together. But what actually makes a situation stressful? Well, first we encounter a novel or unpredictable situation, and then through largely subconscious processes, we go through this two-step approach, where we do a situational assessment, and then we do an assessment of our resources. And basically, for it to be perceived as an acutely stressful situation, it's a threat, as opposed to a challenge. So, if this situation, it looks difficult, and I haven't got the resources to deal with it because I haven't got people to help me, I'm junior, whatever, that's going to be stressful. However, I could be in the same situation, doing that crike or whatever, or getting that difficult tube, but I've got 20 years experience, I've been in this situation many times before, I've got lots of people to help me. Well, now it becomes a challenge, the exact same situation. And that may differ from one day to the next, because if I was up all night looking after my sick kid and then forgot to load the dishwasher and got a bollocking as I walked out the door, my individual resilience on that day may be a little bit less. And so stress isn't all bad, because if we didn't have any stress at all, it would be a boring life. And there's this idea of the Yerkes-Dodson law, where there's an optimal level of arousal for performance. And that depends probably a bit on the task. But like if you're walking into an exam, you probably want to be awake. But you don't want to be so shaky that you can't function. And this goes back now to the other stuff that we've talked about, the burnout and the chronic stress. So ultimately, this is when we collapse, is when these acute stressors combined with what we're having to deal with chronically exceeds our dynamic resilience on that day and the resources we have available to deal with the situation. And so for the next part, I just want to talk about how we can actually train for stress. And this is important because we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. And this stuff basically comes from stress inoculation training, which is about helping people with psychological problems. And then subsequent to that, there was this concept of stress exposure training, which is largely people in like SWAT teams and stuff with that. How do they deal with this stuff? And basically it's a process of conceptualization, so understanding what the stress response is, and in particular what happens to you as an individual, the triggers and the manifestations. Then rehearsing the techniques that you can use to control these, and then applying them in a graded situation, so like simulation and then real situations. So I've broken it down into three sort of areas that I'll just touch on briefly. So there's things that we can do before we encounter the stress. And this is important because everyone has a plan, like the great philosopher Mike Tyson said, until they get punched in the mouth. So we need to think about which situations are going to trigger it, anticipate it, so that we know when to use these skills. the ultimate defense against this stuff is knowing your shit. So overlearning the things that you're going to do. Practice, practice, practice. Doing that crike on the simulator many, many times. That you need a system and a culture that supports training and gives you time to do that. Visualization and mental practice, I think, is really important. I did this a lot when I prepared for my exams. Conditions like acromegaly I didn't see a lot of, but I imagined walking around the bed doing every aspect of that exam. I'd done it over and over in my mind. And from areas like sports psychology, there's really strong evidence of the benefit of this. There's people who just by visualizing throwing basketballs through hoops improve their performance in an objective way. And if you want a way to do this, go to this web link, follow the link here to this PETLIP approach, which will talk you through the ways that you can actually do effective visualization. And it involves all of these things that I won't go into in detail right now. So that's stuff that you can do beforehand. What about when you're in the situation and the stress is, you're experiencing those stresses, what can you do to reset? Well, the first thing, just before I mention this, is that there's stuff like having good CRM skills, use of cognitive aids, using the team around you, that's really important for cognitive offloading, and we should certainly do. But these are some other key things. So square breathing. So everyone, just do this with me. I want you to, over 4 seconds, take a deep breath in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Slowly breathe out for 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you keep going around that cycle, ideally for 2 minutes, but even a short breath helps. We all know that. How often do we say, just take a deep breath? And it's really, really important. So SWAT teams teach this. The reason why it works is that there's very little of our autonomic nervous systems that we can control, and breathing is one of the few things that we can do. Some people call it the steering wheel of our autonomic system. And obviously people who do yoga and stuff like that know this very well. Self-talk is really important. How often in the acute situation are we critical of ourselves? Learning to give yourself effective self-talk is really important. So this can be affirmative, just saying, you know, you've got this. Or what I like to do is instructional self-talk. And I'll even do this out loud because then people think I'm a really good teacher. So I actually just tell myself the steps as I'm going. And then it shares the mental model as well. And it just keeps you on track, one step at a time. That's how you climb a mountain, one step at a time. And when you practice this stuff over and over, people use this idea of cue words to get themselves into these idealized performance states. So elite athletes, when they do this, they'll have a word like focus, which just when they say it, it immediately, because they practice that breathing, getting into that calm state, eventually that word becomes the trigger for them. And then the last bit I just want to mention is this idea that after the stuff that we can do after we've experienced stress, to make things better and also prepare us for the next time. I'm showing you here a picture of a man climbing Mount Everest, and the reason for that is that most deaths in mountaineering happen on the way down. And we have this sort of what's been called a parasympathetic backlash, where naturally after a stressful situation we start doing high fives, we get a bit loose with what's happening. We have to guard against that. And the other thing that can happen is you go into a family meeting and you're all amped up from this acute stressful situation, and so you need to be able to reset somehow, because going in with that sort of energy probably isn't the right thing. So I've got a fairly contrived mnemonic here. I like to have all the loose ends tied up after a stressful situation, so I want to check in on the team. That may mean people will have to take a break or even go home. You should always take that opportunity to get some food and drink in. Make sure you resupply equipment so that you're ready for the next arrest. And do a hot debrief. And even if that just means establishing the facts so that there's people who don't go away thinking, oh my God, it was me because I did that or I didn't do that, that's the value of it. You may not have time or have the emotional space to do a really detailed debrief later, but that can be set up later on. But doing something in that acute situation to acknowledge things, I think, is important. And then finally, after all of this, go away and reflect, not just on what happened there, but actually think about your stress response. So what were the triggers? What made you feel stressed? What did you do to try and control it? What can you do next time to notice those triggers earlier and control them when they happen using techniques like these? So to finish up, these are my key take-home points. The stress response is normal. It's part of human beings. It's just something we've got to accept. It's got physical and psychological manifestations, and probably the psychological and that effect on cognitive bandwidth is the key part. But it is modifiable. It's all dependent on perception, so we can change our perceptions and we can learn to control these things. And then finally, there's stuff that we can do to prepare. There's stuff that we can do to reset our responses in real time, and then we can do things to reflect and recover after the fact. And we need to train for stress. But part of that, we need a system and a culture that gives us time to train for this and actually learns the best way to do it. There's no literature on this I'm aware of in our specialty. Just remember Mr. T, beat the stress full. Breathe, talk, see, and focus. Thank you very much.